All right. Really great to be here at API Days. I know it's the first in-person event for a while. Hopefully you don't have monkeypox coming back and changing everything. I'm going to be talking about monetizing APIs. A little bit about myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif, the leading API analytics and monetization platform. I also love IPAs, and we have different integrations with API gateways like Kong, Amazon API Gateway, and a few others. And today we're going to be talking about why is it hard to sell to developers. Well, developers themselves are usually skeptical of sales and marketing. In addition, they have a lot more autonomy to make buying decisions. These days, buying software is much more decentralized than it was 5 or 10 years ago. In addition, you have not invented here syndrome. What that means is a lot of times different companies want to build stuff internally instead of adopting other software. Well, now it works. The last thing that I want to speak on is the fact that it's, let's see, all right, there we go. The second piece is, what do you think about an API and it's being integrated with other systems out there? And what this means is you need a lot of stakeholders to make a buy decision. This includes legal and security review. This includes procurement process. And the biggest thing about APIs is you're touching a lot of times production data. And what that means is it's not like you can just go up and buy a piece of software. Instead, you have to do a lot of complex risk analysis. Should I go adopt this API or not? As an individual developer, you can't make that decision alone. Instead, you have to wait for your VP level or someone else to say, hey, it's okay for you to adopt this piece of technology. So how do you shorten that feedback loop and that time to purchase software? Well, the first thing you can do is land developers themselves and land them quickly. And the way you do that is get them to pay a token amount. Maybe it's $50 a month, maybe it's $100 a month, something small that allows them to use their manager's credit card and get to testing out the API quickly. What you're trying to do here is get them to their first API call and see if they can actually get some value out of the platform. And when you do so, what you're actually able to do is sidestep all these different processes that you have. So for example, instead of doing a bunch of legal red lines and all that type of stuff, you're able to just leverage simple click-through terms of service. Instead of dealing with procurement processes and other different processes at the organization, you just get to use the manager's credit card. And so it's a super fast integration process, super fast time to get up and running with the API, at least to that simple first initial trial or sandbox stage. And then from there, what you're actually doing is selling through these developers. Because at the end of the day, it's still the VP level or C-suite that is making these final decisions in terms of strategy and what type of technologies they should adopt and spread throughout the organization. But at that point, you already have a bunch of developers already using their product and testing it out. And so when you think about sales and selling an API, instead you're selling through these developers, driving up the usage of the API. Maybe there's additional teams, you can do a land and expand strategy, or maybe there's certain requirements, whether that's compliance requirements, maybe you need single sign-on or something else in order for you to leverage this throughout the organization. This also means your sales process is quite different than it used to be 5 or 10 years ago when we all think about a field sales team, whining and dining, maybe going to the golf course or something like that. Completely different today. And what that means is your sales team is actually engaging at a much later stage in the buying journey. At the point that sales is getting engaged, there's probably some test traffic. You got some developers that love this API. They see it's simple to use. They love the onboarding process, and they're growing their usage. And what sales is trying to do is understand the different use cases, be a little bit more consultative, and hopefully drive higher adoption or usage of the API, which then translates usually into dollars and cents. And one of the great things about APIs is they are transactional in nature. And so you can actually get a developer paying only $50 a month initially because they're only sending maybe some test data, maybe it's a simple app which is 5 or 10 users, they're using it internally and sharing across employees. Then they roll that out to production, and suddenly the volume is completely different. And because it's already integrated, they're not going to just go rip that out and start from scratch. They're probably already testing a couple of different solutions, and now it's just about helping them increase their usage, help them understand and get more value out of the platform. Now, the tricky thing, though, is each API business is different. Sometimes you're going to have a higher top-down sales motion. Sometimes it's going to be bottoms up. Sometimes it's going to be usage-based. Sometimes it won't. And so what I'm going to walk through here is these 3 or 4 different areas that are important when you think about your pricing strategy. The first is prepaid versus postpaid. The second here is, will you actually implement usage-based pricing, or will you use typical SaaS-based pricing where you have 1 or 2 or 3 different tiers? And when you invoice, is it when there's a threshold that's being breached? Is it at a certain period of time passed? And so on. So let's go through the first piece, which is billing strategy. In this case, we're actually comparing 2 different billing strategies of when a customer will track their usage. You have prepaid billing, which is when we think about buying one of those burner phones, and you pay maybe $50, and you haven't even used a service yet, but you already put down your credit card and purchased some sort of credits. Then you have postpaid, which is, if you're using something like Verizon or AT&T, you have your plan set up, you basically got credit extended to you from the telco, and then you pay that bill at the very end of that service. And so there's some pros and cons for each of these. On the prepaid side, the great thing is you got actually better cash flow for the business. You already got the cash up front before you even had to service that subscription. And this could be great, especially if your API itself is costly from a unit economics perspective. If there's something behind the scenes that you have to go pay third-party vendors and that type of stuff, it might be very expensive for you to actually leverage postpaid billing. It's also more familiar with typical enterprise sales processes, where you're paying for a year up front, or maybe it's 2 years or 3 years. And so for larger enterprises, they're actually used to some type of prepaid billing model. Now, the con, though, is there's a lot more onboarding friction. So as an individual developer or someone that is just trying to get up and running as quick as possible, they might not necessarily want to go ask their manager for a lot of money up front. Or they don't even know how much usage they're going to use. Is it X number of transactions, or is it X times 1,000 number of transactions? And that's where some of the postpaid billing comes into play. Because at that point, they're already integrating the API, and then they're able to start paying for that service once they consumed it. In addition, now they don't have to think about how many credits or how many tokens they need before they start consuming that API. Now, the con is that it could be abused, though, especially if this is an API that, again, there's some expensive service or vendor that you have. You don't want developers to sign up for 1,000 free accounts and be able to walk away with a lot of money. The second thing we're going to talk about is packaging strategy. And the 2 common paths we've seen is typical tiered pricing strategy, which is what we see usually with traditional SaaS companies. And the second is pay-as-you-go. And sometimes people call this usage-based pricing. We call it consumption-based pricing. There's a couple different terms for it. But what you're basically doing is you're paying for each, whether it's an API call or some type of metric that you're metering and pricing on. And again, there's some pros and cons for each of these strategies. On the tiered pricing side, the great thing is it enforces minimum spend. And so if your support costs are very high, it might be very hard if a developer signs up and they only use 5 cents worth of your service or 20 cents worth of your service. It's also very easy to implement. You just have to get up and running with a billing provider or ERP system or whatever else you already have set up. And you probably already have all these in place because you might have some other SaaS or UI-based products. Of course, again, there's some friction in expansion because now what you're doing is you're forcing those customers, they have to go upgrade their plan once they're breaching those quota limits. And so there's no natural expansion strategy with these tiered pricing. The other big piece is you have this gap between one plan and the next, where there's perceived value versus what the plan costs to a customer. What I mean by that is if a developer or customer expects, say $200 worth of value, or that's their perceived value, and your plan is $150, then they're basically getting a $50 delta. Now, if your next plan is, say, $500, now that's a jump of $300, but let's say they only see about maybe $250 or $300 worth of value. So now you're negative $200. So how do you ensure that that jump to the next plan is seamless? And so that's where we go into these pay-as-you-go models, where you don't have to think about which plan or tier that you need to be on. It's a lot more efficient for the customer, because 1 month they might just pay for 5 cents worth of transactions, and the next month they can actually pay for 5,000 or 10,000 worth of transactions. So it can appear a lot cheaper for your customers, and it's a lot more efficient. Now, the hard part about it is that it's extremely hard to meter and audit and set up this process. And so it's very complex, and so it takes a little bit longer to get up and running. Of course, this is one of the reasons why we created Moesif was to actually make this a little bit easier, but there's a lot of different ways to do that. The third piece is invoicing strategy. And there's two common ways that we've seen people invoice. And this is more of a financial concern, so this might come from your CFO or someone from the finance department in terms of cash flow and how to manage that from an accounting perspective. On the recurring side, one of the great things is it's easier for finance teams to handle and reconcile those payments. You can align it to monthly, quarterly, some type of calendar year, which just makes it more easier to manage and more predictable. Now, one of the hard things, though, is it could be have bad unit economics, especially, again, if your API itself is low cost. So going back to that usage-based model on the last slide, what if they only use 5 cents worth of your API in 1 month and then 10 cents the next month? Now you're dealing with these very, very tiny payments. And so it could have bad unit economics. It can be also very complex if it's prepaid. Because in this case, you had to figure out what that bill should be. Whereas then we can go into the threshold-based. This is a little bit different strategy. This was seen a lot within the advertising market where you pay $500 and you have a bunch of ads, and once you reach $500, you get invoiced. And so you get invoiced at different thresholds. And one of those might be dollars and cents. Once you have $1,000 spent with the company, you get an invoice. And one of the great things here is, again, you're reducing that transaction cost. It can also make prepaid easier. So if you look at companies like Twilio, where you actually buy a certain number of credits or tokens, maybe it's $20 worth, and then you can use those credits. So you don't need to think about what that usage will be. You're just, again, paying and basically putting a down payment before you actually use a service. Now, the con here, though, is finance teams might not necessarily like this because it can be very hard to manage and reconcile, and you're also increasing some company liability. Because in this case, you're actually having company or different customers put a prepayment before they use the service, and so now you actually have those things. It could be on your balance sheet, depends on how you account for them. Now, how do you actually figure out how to price and meter your API? And that's where we talk about different value metrics. And you can choose a lot of different ones. Sometimes you might have multiple. You might have 2 or 3 different things to price on. Here's a couple examples I'm providing here. The first one here is transaction volume. Very common. We've seen this, especially within analytics companies, telco, where it might be number of text messages sent. It might be number of events being processed or something like that. The second model we've seen is revenue share or cost share. Stripe is a popular version of this. We're paying a percentage of the transaction fees. On the expense reporting platforms, we've also seen this used quite heavily. The third example is what we call data volume. And this is used heavily within like logging companies, sometimes within infrastructure. In this case, you're tracking some type of volume, and that could be minutes used, it could be gigabytes sent, and then you're just measuring that up and then sending out the invoice based on that volume. The next one we have is user-centric. We see this a lot within customer-facing applications, or where you're tracking number of users, maybe it's number of monthly active users or monthly tracked users. Slack is a popular model where they're tracking monthly tracked users. Segment is doing the same thing. And the last here is resource-based. And this is more used within infrastructure companies where we might be tracking number of hours used, or maybe it's compute hours or something like that. However, one of the hard things to manage is how do you scale account management and support. When you first start out, you're going to have all these individual developers using your API, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can focus and outreach to every single one. And so that's not a scalable system to have. And so they're going to have issues during the onboarding process. They're going to have questions on how to integrate. The API is not working correctly. They get 400 errors. There's going to be changing business needs. Maybe they have to add additional functionality or additional team members to the account. They're going to have different surprises around billing, invoicing, and that type of stuff. And so what we recommend is actually making as much as possible self-service. And that way, your sales and account management team and CSM team can focus on the accounts that matter. So for example, to reduce some of the billing surprises, make a self-service portal so they can see exactly what their usage is trending like and what their invoice is expected to be. Provide a way to allow them to upgrade or change their account as needed. That way you don't need to be engaged every single time these small and mundane tasks come up. The other big thing is avoid billing surprises. And this is one of the biggest gotchas we've seen, especially with usage-based billing models. You don't want a developer to sign up in month 0 and they pay $50 a month, and a week later they get a $10,000 bill. Because that is not a good customer experience or developer experience. Now they have to explain to a manager why they signed up for this service and why is there a $10,000 a month bill that never got routed through procurement and no one knew about it. And so what we recommend is setting up a system that will notify your customers when they're increasing their usage, and maybe it's going to be beyond what they would expect. And that could be some type of a quota limit, and you send out an email when they breach a certain quota. It could be even more complex where they can set up their own thresholds. So for example, alert me when my bill is expected to be above $1,000 or something like that. So empower your customers to manage their own cost and just be transparent and over-communicate these type of things that come about. The other thing you can look at is reducing friction, and you can do this by looking at different partners and app ecosystems that are out there. So for example, at that manager's credit card that was used to pay for this service, and he decides to leave the company, then that credit card might get terminated, it might get canceled. And so you can actually leverage things like Amazon Marketplace and the Salesforce App Exchange, which allow you to be another line item with their AWS account that they already have, which is pretty likely that one of those customers is already an AWS customer at the same time, or maybe an Azure customer. And this helps reduce some of those credit card issues. Now, speaking on how to measure and track this customer experience, what we recommend taking a look at is 2 fundamental steps in the activation and engagement process. So first is what we call time to hello world. And this is the time that it takes to make that very first API call. That might be by using a tool like Postman. It might be by making a single API call through curl. But at least the developer is putting the work into testing out the API, and they're looking at your documentation and seeing if it will fit their needs or not. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they got to see the full value out of the platform. They're not necessarily engaged. They just tested it with Postman. What you're really aiming for is they're rolling out some type of integration to a wider audience. Whether that API is going to be used by their end users, maybe it's going to be used by internal employees and team members. But you want to make sure there's a lot of engagement and usage happening through the API. And that's where we get to the first working app. And that is the time it takes for them to get to, maybe it's 100 API calls, maybe it's sending 1,000 documents through the API if it's an e-signature platform. Whatever it is, just making sure that you have that metric and you're tracking it. And there's actually 2 different ways you can track that engagement. And both are perpendicular to each other. One is the usage itself, and that is increasing the volume. So instead of sending 1 text message of your telco API, maybe it's going up to sending 100 text messages or 1,000. But the other way you can actually measure this is the breadth of different APIs they may be using. So for example, going back to the telco example, are they sending text messages? Are they also sending videos through the API, doing transcriptions? So using a lot of different features. So tracking both of those is really important to truly understand the engagement of your users. And so what do you measure in this case? There's really 2 fundamental metrics. The first is the activation or that conversion rate itself. But the second piece is the time it takes. Is it 1 day or is it 14 days? Is it 3 months for them to go from one step to the next? That way you can actually try and shorten that timeline as much as possible and squash it. Because until they get to that last step, it's very hard for you to actually have a paying customer that is seeing a lot of value from the platform. But one of the tricky things with these APIs is there's a lot of different developers out there. There might be a non-technical folks signing up for your API. There might be junior developers signing up for your API, each with different roles, each with different experience levels. So how do you actually get accurate analytics and understanding around things like your activation rate when there might be a bunch of non-developers? And of course, they're never going to be able to use your API because it's just not in their realm. And so trying to segment and understand that based off of developer persona. You can also do the same thing through things like marketing campaigns. And so what I'm showing here is an activation funnel where the first step there is sign up. And the second step is a single purchase API transaction. But then we're breaking that down by marketing campaigns. So you can see how, say, AdWords versus outreach from the sales team and other marketing and sales efforts that you have going on at the company, how are they trending and which one is driving the best activation rate? You can do the same thing by developer persona. So for example, folks who sign up with a Gmail account or a free email service versus the folks who are using a corporate email. How does the activation rate compare? And you'll most likely be surprised to see how the corporate emails just have a fundamentally higher activation rate, because now you're able to filter out folks who might be a student or they may not necessarily understand what the API is in the first place, and then they're just signing up for the service and not able to see any value anyways. So if there's one key takeaway from this presentation, deliver a great self-service onboarding and over-communicate as much as possible. Whether that's the billing surprises, make sure you have those emails in place. Whether it's getting up and running, make sure you have the guidance and tutorials so they can actually get their app up and running. Any questions?
Any question? Thank you very much, Derric. Any questions on monetization? Yeah, so you can applause. Yeah. Any questions in the room? I have a question for you, Derric. So you promote self-service, and actually this is the main strength of APIs, that people can discover, discover, sign up, read the docs, implement in total self-service way that really scale, the integration and consumption that really makes you, let's say, a kind of a platform, right, at some point. But on the other side, pricing is something you will not be there about why people buy. Pricing can be really complex. Many degrees of liberty. So how do you manage this wheel of full self-service automation? I'm not here, you consume, you go, you leave, versus the startup aspect about nurturing and designing the right pricing, listening to what people say. How do you manage the two, right? The human aspect of understanding versus the fully self-service and autonomous platform.
It's a good question, and it's not easy to do. Developers are known for a lot of times not talking to sales and marketing. They don't want to chat with anyone. What we usually recommend is you start segmenting your customer base. And so you're going to have one bucket of customers that we call those the self-service customers. They get all these automated emails. They have pretty much everything self-service. But then you're going to start picking and choosing customers that look like, that's a promising opportunity, and it looks like someone that's within our ideal customer profile. And so those are the folks that sales is going to be really engaged with. And you can look at both who they are in terms of maybe the company they work with, title, and that type of stuff, but also what are they doing with the platform? Is their usage increasing? Did they get activated or not? And that actually helps allow you to prioritize who to outreach to. Because you can't outreach to hundreds of thousands of developers at the same time.
Yeah, so the one who didn't sign up or went to the next step, and actually you try to get information real real information from them about, what did you understand? Oh, we want to pay by the user. We don't pay by the resource. Interesting. Okay, maybe I should change my business model or my pricing model if more people say that. So this is what you recommend?
Yep.
The customer discovery, the developer discovery?
Yeah, so you have to do some customer discovery. Sometimes that's driven through support. So you're going to see interesting both good and bad, support requests, and they're saying, why are you pricing this way? This doesn't make sense to me, or why do you not have that feature on this particular plan? Now, of course, you still have to always take a step back and think about the overall, product goals and API strategy, because the customer is going to say one thing, but they're of course thinking in their terms and not necessarily the overall platform strategy. But yeah, listening through support calls and support tickets, and just hopping on the phone and just walking through and asking questions. Where do you see value in this API? What is the true value? And an example that I like to give is, let's say you're an email service provider, and you provide some type of email automation, and you have an API to access that. There's a couple different things you can meter on. One option would be maybe it's a number of email templates that's in this platform. Now, of course, as a customer of this email service provider, I could create 1,000 templates, but never ever send a single email to the platform. That means I get very little value out of it. but I still have this high bill because I'm paying for the number of templates. So a better metric to probably meter on is the number of emails being sent through the platform, because that's a value that me as a customer is getting. I'm trying to maybe reach out to leads or reach out to someone, and in order to do that, I need to send out those emails. Maybe another option is number of unique contacts or unique people that are being reached, but something that is more closer to the value that is created through API versus just some arbitrary metric.
Yeah. I will ask just maybe a last one. Like some people use API management to know pricing. They see a bell curve of users and they say, okay, we monetize from these ones. Like, do you recommend that or no?
It's hard. I mean, because each person is going to have different needs, and you're going to have different things to meter on. What we usually do recommend is at least have a couple of different things to meter or bill on or invoice on. That way, you're able to capture value. Because one of the biggest things they can run into is you can create a lot of value, but if you don't have the right things to invoice on, they're not able to capture enough. And so you're going to have one segment of customers, maybe they're very low volume, but they have very specific needs. They have compliance, requirements and a bunch of other stuff. You have another set of customers, very little compliance requirements, but very high volume. And so how do you make sure you can capture value from both segments?
Yeah, thank you very much, Derric. Thank you. It was really insightful.